Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm Stacy Katz, the Open Resources Librarian / STEM Liaison, and I'd like to warmly welcome you to our reading today on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Physics Department and Center for Theoretical and Computational Sciences, and on behalf of Kenneth Schlesinger, Chief Librarian, and my colleague on the Readings Committee, Allison Lehner-Quam. These campus-wide discussions provide an opportunity for us all to gather together to hear about current publications and scholarship written by Lehman faculty and alumni. We are honored that pre-health advisor Dr. Scott Calvin will be sharing his new book, Beyond Curie, 4 Women in Physics and Their Remarkable Discoveries, 1903 to 1963. Pam Mills, chair of the chemistry department, will introduce Dr. Calvin. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. All right, so well, you'll see why I'm introducing Scott as we go through this. So I'm going to start you with 1989. And those of you who remember 1989, it's Prince, Madonna, Janet Jackson, right? And then there's the pedagogy. I started at Hunter College in 1989, so this is relevant. And the advice I got was, here's what you need to do when you teach. Go right in, tell the students, look right, look left, shake your hands, only one of you will survive. That was the dominant form of chemistry pedagogy. So, and then if you walked around the halls, this is what you saw. Call Paul, call Leo, call John. Ace tutor, pull off, this is pre-internet, pull the slip, give us a call. And into this milieu came somebody named Scott. So a tutor name emerged, Scott. Do you go to Scott? Well, Scott's there, but look at what Scott's doing. Not look right, look left. He's doing, school's tough, I'm tougher, right? I got help from Mirari Services. So who is this Scott guy? So the Scott guy came and talked to me, the only tutor who ever did. What are we doing? How are you doing it? This is what I think we could do. And I realized that this was an extraordinary educator, right? So we started talking. And then weird things happened. Now I should mention, Scott is a PhD from physics in Berkeley, right? So out comes an MCAT book in physics. That doesn't seem so weird. But then comes one in chemistry. And look who the lead author is. So now this weird physicist tutor is now talking about chemistry. But it gets even odder. Organic chemistry. Scott comes by and says, I have to learn organic chemistry because I'm tutoring it. Right? Organic chemistry is hard enough, but for a physicist, I never thought it was even possible. So now he's tutoring organic. So let's advance 10 years. So Scott decides he's had it with tutoring, and he's going to grad school. So off he heads to CUNY grad school in physics. He's still at Hunter. He's worked for Martin Den Board Hunter. And we're running a new course that's a ChemPhys math course that was really exciting to do, and we needed the best physics teacher, which was Scott. So as a grad student, Scott worked with us in developing the course, and a lot of materials were written. And so Scott wrote the materials in addition to doing all the normal research that he was doing. Now, somewhere between that time and 2009, Scott and I, we kind of parted ways, not just kind of the life took us apart and back together and apart and back together. So in 2009, Scott is tenured in physics at Sarah Lawrence. And that's really where that picture comes. So I guess this is a picture of the kind of faculty Sarah Lawrence is tenuring. And he's writing normal kinds of papers that are in Journal of Applied Physics. But he's also writing things like XFs for everyone. We can all do it. So I didn't really have a lot of contact with Scott. We're in and out, emailing periodically. But I do want to point this one out. Sarah Lawrence is the first, the women's history program was first started at Sarah Lawrence by Gerda Lerner. And I didn't realize that they have a nice plaque there. So the relevance is that Gerda Lerner left Sarah Lawrence, came to where I was in graduate school and started the first PhD program in women's history, and my roommate was in her first class. So we still have connections in these very odd ways. So now let's go to 2016, Lehman College. So we have a pre-medical search committee. We're looking for a pre-med advisor. What are we going to do? I'm on the committee, Haiping is on the committee, and Lisa Moellen is on the committee. I'll let you figure out who's who around the table. And so we're very worried. The pre-med advisor has left. We have students who want to get into the pipeline. And so we finally make an offer. We find a guy we like. The guy turns us down. So now what are we going to do? So we're in a state of panic. This is the only time I ever could imagine putting these two dudes on the same page and feeling nostalgic for those days. But in any case, In my inbox is an email. I'm leaving Sarah Lawrence. Do you know anyone who wants a pre-med advisor? How did this ever happen, right? So now we're talking about one of the best educators in science, and he's written the books for the pre-med, and he says, I want to leave Sarah Lawrence. So we have another pre-med committee. We go back. Scott comes and talks to the committee. One of the members on the committee is thinking what we're all thinking. This guy's giving up tenure. Is this guy okay? So I knew the guy was okay, but the rest of us were wondering, is this guy really okay? So what is Hai-Ping, if you know him, very gentlemanly, he says, why do you want this job? He's thinking, are you a nut? And Scott says, he talks about pre-med and what he can do, and then he says, but I want some more time. And I don't get enough time as a professor. I'm going to have more time. The job is more well-defined. So Hai-Ping says, what are you going to do with your time? And Scott says, I'm going to finish my book. And with that, I will have introduced Dr. Scott Calvin, who's physicist, pre-med advisor, teacher. Interesting.
So thank you very much, Pam. That definitely brought back a lot of memories. I'll just put two things off of that introduction. One is those goggles I'm wearing. You should know that they are actually a working pair of death ray goggles. You could actually look at the sun. The polarizers come down so you can look at the sun safely, and then the mirror will focus so you can, for example, light a match with them. So they weren't just decorative, they actually worked. And that was for a class I was teaching called Steampunk Physics, in case you wonder where all that came from. Other thing is I'll give you a brief story about sort of when I met Pam. I was running the tutoring. I had spoken to her a few times. But running a tutoring business by yourself is hard. It's just hard to make it all work, and if you're sick one day, then everybody's depending on you, and how do you do this? And so I'd always thought that if I found somebody who was giving me any sort of real competition, that I would try to join forces with them and see if they wanted to do this. Well, I had been getting tons of people from Hunter College, and suddenly one year, the number of people from Hunter I got started dropping off. I was like, what is going on? So I looked into it. And it turned out that Pam had set up some new kind of peer tutoring and some new ways of teaching chemistry and some new kinds of things at Hunter College, and it was working. It was the first time I had ever had that happen. And so I said, well, I always said that if that happened, I would go join forces, and so I guess it's time to go back to grad school. And that really is pretty much how I made that decision, how I ended up going back to grad school. I'd always thought about it, but that was the moment, and I knew that I could be part of this new Frosh program that was going on. And it was very exciting, and it was the right moment, the right opportunity. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the book. Today what I'm going to do is, although this book focuses on 4 remarkable scientists, I'm going to talk about one today just because we have a limited amount of time, and I think it's more interesting to go a little more in depth and see how things work than to try to go broad overview. But because I know some of you are wondering about the broad overview, I'm going to start, and yes, I actually am going to do some readings at the reading. I'm going to start by giving you my conclusion. So you kind of get a sense of where I end up, where the book ends up in terms of thinking about these things. So, one of the great benefits of focusing on 4 prominent women in physics, rather than just one, is that it mitigates the idea that each one has to stand in for her entire gender, at least within the profession. It becomes clear that Wu's assertive style is not the only one possible for a woman in the field any more than Meyer's deference is. They are different people with different strengths and personalities. There are many ways to be a genius. But are there commonalities between them? 4 is still a pretty small sample size, and it also suffers from selection bias. I chose 4 prominent female physicists who interest me and make no claim that these 4 are the most prominent from the period. Still, I think we can see a few common threads. One is indisputable. Each of these scientists was, often for large stretches of her career, underpaid. There seems to have been no way for them to defend against this problem. It happened when they were unknown and when they were famous, in the 1920s and in the 1960s, to the married and unmarried in America and in Germany. Another is that each faced a delay in her career somewhere along the line that probably would not have happened to a man. A third commonality is more subtle. Each achieved a measure of fame during her lifetime, both within the scientific community and with the general public. But each has also faded from public consciousness over time, perhaps to a greater extent than men of equal stature. I think that it is in part due, ironically, to the mythologizing of particular women in science. In these myths, there is one great woman scientist, Marie Curie. At some later date in these myths, there is one additional brilliant woman scientist, sometimes explicitly referred to as the such and such Madame Curie, the Canadian Madame Curie, or whatever it might be. This woman, the second one of two, works alone in a field that is entirely made up of men, makes a brilliant discovery, has the credit stolen by a man, and then dies in obscurity. And by the way, we hold these people up as role models, right? Isn't this what you want to do? Like all myths, there are variations in the tellings. Sometimes, for example, the end emphasizes recognition late in life or posthumously. At other times, the modern obscurity is emphasized. But the central elements appear again and again. Also, like other myths, they contain some elements of truth, and they tell us something about the world, but they also risk distorting history and devaluing the contributions of ordinary people. In particular, the version of these myths I've outlined above requires suppressing the contributions of other women. It spoils the simple narrative to mention that Meyer and Wu both worked at Columbia on the Manhattan Project, or that one of the chief rivals of a team of Meitner and Hahn was a team of Curie and Joliot. Certainly, each worked in a field dominated by men, but not to the point that other women were absent. There are also commonalities that have to do with the experience of all or most physicists, regardless of gender. Each has role models and mentors, moments of doubt and periods of obsession, allies and rivals, and priority disputes. Okay, so the one I'm going to focus on is Cecilia Payne. Briefly, Cecilia Payne was a leading 20th century astrophysicist. She did some of her most important work early on in her career in the 20s. She was really the first to demonstrate through analysis of data, but mathematical and physical analysis, that the stars are made mostly of hydrogen and helium, and that therefore the visible universe is made mostly of hydrogen and helium. Okay, that was her. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the science that goes into this, and then we're going to look at the history about how she got to this point, including focusing on what the kind of central historical mystery of her career is. And I'll get to that in a moment. So what was she doing in her famous work in the 20s? What she was doing was she was applying physics to stellar spectra, to the spectra of stars. You put starlight through, say, a prism. It splits out into rainbow colors, but there are lines in those spectra that tell you something about the chemical composition of the surface of the stars, tell you something about what elements are present. And people knew this. People had known this for decades at that point. But she wanted to go ahead and apply physical theories because it turns out, you might think, oh, if lines are really dark, really prominent in the spectrum, it must mean there's a lot of that element. Well, to see how well that works, I want to do a little analogy. Suppose you wanted to know about the kind of demographics of some city. You wanted to know ratio of male to female. You wanted to know what the age distribution was. You want to know these kinds of questions. And so you decide to do it by calling up landlines at random, talking to the person who answers the phone, and then taking down their data and moving on to the next landline. Is that going to give you a good picture of a distribution in the city? No, right? Why not? Yeah, and particularly, for example, babies, right? There is no baby who's going to be answering the phone and telling you how old they are. It is going to appear that the city is devoid of babies, right? Among lots and lots and lots of other problems. So you can't just look at the spectrum of a star and say, oh, look, the iron line's really dark. There must be lots more iron than everything else. Because the problem is that how strong the spectrum is for a given element also depends, how strong the spectral lines, also depends on the temperature of the surface layers of a star, and to a small extent on density, but largely on the temperature. And so you got to kind of be applying physics to figure out how the temperature is affecting the strength of the lines and working your way back and forth. And people had thought about this, but nobody had ever really done it. And so she decided she was going to do this. Now, at the time, astronomers pretty much guessed that all the stars were made of roughly the same stuff in roughly the same proportion, that there was such a thing as star stuff, right? That it was all going to be sort of similar things. And this was kind of a guess, but it seemed like sort of a reasonable guess. And they went a step further. They also guessed that that star stuff was the same as Earth stuff, that the stars were made out of similar stuff as the Earth in similar proportions. After all, this has been a great principle for centuries now in astronomy, what's called the Copernican Principle, which basically says there's nothing special about us. The Earth is not the center of a solar system. It goes around the sun. The sun is not the center of the galaxy. It's kind of off to the side somewhere. The galaxy is not the center of a universe, right? There are all sorts of galaxies everywhere, right? There is nothing special about us. And so the thought was, well, there's nothing special about our composition either. Probably the stars are made of the same stuff as Earth. They're just hot, so they glow. Okay? And certainly the elements were present, right? We could see iron here. We could see iron there. We first saw helium actually in a stellar spectrum, then we found it here, right? I said, okay, this is all working, okay? So what she did for her dissertation was she assumed that stars were all made of the same stuff. And then she looked at lots and lots and lots of stellar spectra that had been gathered over decades and analyzed and classified by a group largely made up of women at Harvard called the Harvard Computers. She took all of that classification, all of that data, and started pouring through it and started saying, well, look, if stars are all made of the same stuff, and I have the physics to say how spectra depend on temperature, then the relative strength of lines in the different stars should all come down to one thing. What's the temperature of the surface layers? Shouldn't be any other differences. I should be able to kind of find a temperature for each one that explains all these hundreds and hundreds of lines, their relative strengths. Okay? So let's see a little bit about where she did this in her dissertation. So I compare here, by the way, her dissertation to Newton's Principia. Why do I do that? Well, partially they're both brilliant pieces of science writing. But also, I'm pretty sure, although she never said this, that consciously or subconsciously or some mixture, she was kind of modeling after the Principia. She went to Cambridge, right? She would have had this drilled into her. This is how you write a masterful piece of science. And there are some similarities in the structure, and I'll talk about that. So like the Principia, Payne's dissertation is divided into three large parts. In both works, the first two parts use a combination of theory and observation to establish the analysis on a firm footing. In the third section of each, the tools from the previous sections are used to draw sweeping conclusions about the universe. Finally, thoughts are given to future directions for study. Related to the structure of each work was its purpose. While popular culture attributes to Newton the idea that it is gravity that makes the planets go around the sun, the moon around the earth, and the apple fall from the tree, the idea had been raised before. It was, so to speak, in the air. Even the gravitational inverse square law, which Newton is famous for, had been anticipated by others, as Newton himself acknowledges in the Principia's Book 1, Proposition 4, Corollary 6. The power of the Principia is not so much that it introduces new ideas, but that it creates a coherent system of the world, that's what he called it, which brings those ideas together. Payne's dissertation is equally clear about what it has accomplished. The conclusion to the chapter on elemental abundances begins with a definitive statement that the surface layers of all stars are made of the same stuff in roughly the same proportions. Quote, "The uniformity of composition of stellar atmospheres appears to be an established fact." End quote. The passive voice obscures her meaning. It was Payne, through her dissertation, who promoted that idea from a common but unproven supposition to a known fact. In the next paragraph, she argues that the uniformity applies not just to the surface layers, but to the stars as a whole, extending the scope of her claim. So she proved what she had set out to accomplish and what was a major, major accomplishment. All right? But there was a side effect. In assuming the stars was made all of the same stuff in the same ratios, she didn't know what those ratios were. She's trying to show that they can all be shown as a function of temperature. As part of that mathematical analysis, out pops the amount of stuff. Okay? And she found out that, yeah, the ratios basically did look like Earth, mostly. You know, you compared iron to nickel and magnesium to oxygen and whatever you want to do, the ratios came out pretty similar to what you found on Earth. Except for two elements. Hydrogen and helium were completely off scale. According to her analysis, there was way, way, way more hydrogen and helium than anything else. So how did she deal with that? I'm going to quote from her dissertation again, and this is a central historical mystery. She writes, "The outstanding discrepancies between the astrophysical and terrestrial abundances are displayed for hydrogen and helium. The enormous abundance derived for these elements in the stellar atmosphere is almost certainly not real. Probably the result may be considered for hydrogen as another aspect of its abnormal behavior, already alluded to, and helium, which has some features of astrophysical behavior in common with hydrogen, possibly deviates for similar reasons. The lines of both atoms appear to be far more persistent at high and low temperatures than those of any other element." And I write, what was she thinking as she wrote that text? Did she, as Neil deGrasse Tyson characterized it in Cosmos, cave to Henry Norris Russell's authority? Henry Norris Russell was one of the leading astrophysicists of the early 20th century in the US, for that matter in the world. He was at Princeton. We'll see where he plays in the story. Was this, as Russell's biographer, Dvorkin suggests, a canny attempt by Payne to, by denying the evidence of her own data, get her analysis showing very high abundances for hydrogen and helium published right under Russell's nose and with his approval? Or did she truly disbelieve her own results? Payne's own recollections do not clarify the matter. When, decades later, Payne was asked about it in an interview by the astronomer and historian of science Owen Gingerich, she claimed not even to remember what she had written. Oh, did I say that? Well, pretty soon I convinced myself that the high abundance was real. I would have said that I always thought that it was so, but it certainly didn't take me very long to be convinced that it was. Gingerich reported that in another conversation, she said that probably Henry Norris Russell talked me out of it. All right, what are we to make of this? Different historians and scientists and people who have looked into this have clearly made different things of this. So in order to understand this, I think we have to understand a little more about Cecilia Payne. We have to know a little bit about what kind of a person she was, what kind of a scientist she was, where she was in her career. So let's talk about that a little bit. As I said, she started out at Newnham College in Cambridge University. That was a women's college within Cambridge. She went there to major. You normally pick 3 subjects. That's the way their system went. And she went there to major in physics, chemistry, and botany. Right? So, okay, that's what she was going to do. She was really interested in botany. That was her favorite, but she was going to do physics and chemistry too. And she, would walk off to classes, which were usually in other parts of Cambridge. So she'd leave the grounds of Newnham. There are these beautiful gates at the front of Newnham, which were a memorial to the first principal of Newnham, who was also a noted suffragist, Anne Jemima Clough. And so they had these beautiful gates there to her. She'd walk past these gates on the way to courses. In the evening, she'd walk past the gates to come home. Now, while she was at Cambridge, there was a big vote, 1921. And the big vote was about whether to give women full rights at Cambridge, full rights to do everything that everybody else was doing. The vote did not go in favor of giving full rights. It was a compromise. The compromise being that women could get degrees, but they would be titular degrees, which pejoratively quickly got shortened to tit degrees, which, that usually gets a laugh, but it's true. I mean, that was the pun they were using, which gave the title of a degree, but none of the rights in terms of being able to sort of vote on things that the university would do or anything like that. Okay? You weren't really a full alum. You had the title of a degree, but nothing else. Now, a lot of the male students thought this was a great victory. So they celebrated by having a riot. And in this riot, they came charging over to the Newnham College, fashioned a makeshift battering ram, and proceeded to pummel these beautiful gates, so mangling them that they were not repaired for years. So now, every day on the way to class, she has to walk by the mangled gates. Every day on the way home, she has to walk back. This very visible reminder of the misogyny that she was facing at Cambridge and, of course, societally. All right. While she was an undergraduate, she happened to score some tickets to this hotshot, up-and-coming superstar in astrophysics' lecture, Arthur S. Eddington. And when I say happened to score him, it was literally the kind of thing where a friend had tickets and was like, oh, I can't do it. I'm going to whatever, right? And so here, you want one of the tickets. She's like, yeah, I'll go. Life-changing. She goes there, she is blown away. She hears Eddington talk about relativity. She, by her own recollection, cannot sleep for 3 days because she's thinking about this stuff so much. She's totally excited about it. She wants to be an astronomer. But at Cambridge, you can't just do that. You got admitted as a physicist, botanist, chemist. You can't just say, now I'm going to be an astronomer. So she focused on physics because it was the closest she could get. She read everything she could read about astronomy, and just that's all she could do. She had to kind of wait for an opportunity. Well, or make an opportunity. One night, the Cambridge Observatory was giving an open house for the public at night, you know, a kind of star night, you know, the kind of thing, right? There's the telescope there, and they invite kids in and people from the community, and Dan is smiling because I think he's probably done some of these kinds of things. And, you know, they look at the telescopes, and you tell them some stuff about it, and great, good PR. And so Cecilia Payne says, oh boy, observatory open house. So she goes right on her bicycle up to the hill where the observatory is, and comes in, and sure enough, there are families there and kids and whatever, and there's some assistant who is showing people through the telescope and talking to them and all that. Well, Payne is very excited. So she starts asking questions. Hard questions. Questions that are on the cutting edge of astronomy. She really wants to know, right? Well, the assistant has no idea how to answer these questions, right? So after a few of these, the assistant basically goes running in terror to his boss. And it's like, there's a woman asking questions. And in the meantime, Cecilia's left out here with all these families and people who have come to see. So what'd she do? She takes over. She starts pointing the telescope around, showing people stuff, explaining to them. She's explaining to a little girl at one point. The little girl's looking through the telescope. She's telling the little girl what she's seeing. At this moment, the assistant's boss comes walking in. The assistant's boss is none other than Arthur S. Eddington, the one who inspired her in the first place. Eddington doesn't know who she is. She was a face in the audience, right? But she sure knows who he is, but doesn't notice because she's so involved in talking to the little girl and showing her the telescope. So Eddington kind of takes in the scene, sort of clears his throat. Payne looks up, sees Eddington, her idol, and just flirts out the first thing that comes into her head, which is, I want to be an astronomer. And Eddington looks back, kind of raises an eyebrow, and says, I can see no insuperable objection, and proceeds to become her mentor. First thing he does, by the way, is tells her, you know, well, here's a list of books to read. She looks at the list and says, yeah, I already read them. And he was like, well, okay, free run of the Cambridge Observatory Library. He mentors her in an undergraduate research project, which ends up getting published in the open literature, right? So she is on her way. She applies for a fellowship for women astronomers, women who want to get into astronomy, which is being offered at Harvard, a kind of post-bac fellowship, kind of year after a bachelor's degree fellowship, gets it. So comes sailing off to Harvard, and shows up there. The director of the observatory is a guy named Shapley, and tells Shapley, okay, you have all these great spectra here, you've done all this great work, and your Harvard computers have done all this great work in classifying them, right? I want to apply to physics sim and try to see if I can figure out what's going on. He says, great, your fellowship, you got it, that's what you're going to do. But there was a problem. The problem was, Henry Norris Russell over at Princeton, different institution, but we've mentioned him, prominent astronomer. He had a grad student, a guy named Menzel. And Menzel was doing the same thing for his dissertation project. And so Shapley at Harvard thinks, oh, that's a little uncomfortable. You know what? Cecilia, you work on these kinds of stars. And Menzel, you work on these kinds of stars. They both ignored him. You know, they were scientists. They were both like, hey, no, we got all the data. We're just working on it. So they worked on it. So I know where you think this is going. I bet you think this is going, this is going to be one of these scientific races who gets there first, right? Priority disputes. No. Menzel finished his dissertation way before Payne had gotten very far on this. But his dissertation was, and anybody who's working on a doctorate here, I'm sorry, or recently got one, was 20 pages long. 6 pages of which were tables. It included a citation to Payne, he's acknowledging her, and the conclusion was basically, this is hard. Congratulations, Dr. Menzel, you have your PhD, right? But this clears the field for her. She starts working on it, she starts publishing papers. This is still as a postbac, right? So let me give you a little bit from the blue tab. Shapley, the director at the Harvard College Observatory, now felt that Payne should pursue a PhD in astronomy at Harvard, but found that this prospect faced several barriers. 1, Payne was a woman, and Harvard did not give degrees to women. 2, Payne did not initially want to get a doctorate. 3, Harvard did not have an astronomy department. They had an observatory, but not an astronomy department. Nevertheless, Shapley persisted. The problem of Harvard being male-only had been addressed, albeit imperfectly, once Radcliffe, the sister school to Harvard, began issuing doctorates in 1902. Already, another one of the people had gotten the same fellowship she got. Adelaide Ames had received a master's degree in astronomy from Radcliffe. Shapley's persistence overcame Payne's reluctance, which was probably never particularly deeply held, solving the second problem. That left the third. While research in astronomy had a long tradition at Harvard, teaching had been neglected, and thus there was no department, either at Harvard or at Radcliffe, which offered a doctorate in astronomy. Shapley, however, kept at it, securing approval from the chair of the physics department at Harvard and the authorities at Radcliffe. In so doing, Payne's project became her dissertation topic, and the astronomy department at Harvard was born. I want to point out, I have seen modern capsule biographies, like internet stuff, of Payne that says she was the first woman to get a PhD in astronomy from Harvard. This is a true statement. By the way, Harvard eventually kind of, I guess, grandmothered in the Radcliffe PhDs and decided those are Harvard PhDs. So that part's right. But saying that she was the first woman to get a PhD in astronomy from Harvard is like saying Neil Armstrong was the first male to set foot on the moon, right? She was the first person to get a PhD in astronomy from Harvard. And in fact, they invented the department so that she could do so, right? She is the reason that there is an astronomy department at Harvard. All right? Read a little further about what happened next. Russell, meanwhile, back at Princeton, with Shapley's encouragement, turned his attention to providing guidance for Payne. In mid-June of 1924, shortly after the completion of Menzel's dissertation, he characterized Payne's nascent dissertation as a first-class piece of work. In August, Payne, as part of a contingent from the Harvard College Observatory, including Shapley and one of the Harvard computers, Annie Jump Cannon, attended the 32nd meeting of the American Astronomical Society in Dartmouth. Russell and Eddington were also in attendance. While there, she was elected to membership in the AAS, the organization that resulted from the 1898 meeting at which Pickering read another Harvard computer. The organization was by this time relatively welcoming to women working in astronomy. Among the officers of this organization, for example, was Dr. Anne S. Young of Mount Holyoke, who had received her own PhD in astronomy at Columbia nearly 20 years before. In all, at least a dozen of the 68 astronomers present were women. Payne was in the vanguard of women in astronomy, but she was far from alone. That fall, Russell visited her twice at Harvard to discuss her work. In contrast to Menzel, she did not limit the scope of her investigations or conclusions without a fight. Russell's first visit left her, in her words, in a state of prostration. His second visit, a month later, left them both that way. In January of 1925, Russell responded to the latest version of her work, revised after their fall meetings. He was generally favorable, but provided 2 sets of suggested corrections, one for magnesium, magnesium ions, and potassium, and the other for hydrogen, helium, and oxygen. By this time, Payne's computations explicitly suggested that the surface layers of the sun were predominantly hydrogen, a conclusion Russell was not ready to accept. Quote, "I'm convinced that there is something seriously wrong with the present theory," he wrote in a letter to Payne. "It is clearly impossible that hydrogen should be 1,000,000 times more abundant than the metals." All right, and then we know what she wrote. So now we have the background. Now we try to figure out what's going on. So here's what I have to say about this last reading, and then we can have questions, discussion. While the question of Payne's beliefs and intents while writing her dissertation may never be conclusively resolved, in the following pages I will discuss several possible explanations and how I've come to my own tentative conclusions. Explanation 1. Payne deferred to Russell's expertise, assuming that he knew astronomy better than she. If we knew nothing about the rest of Payne's life and writings, this would be plausible. Russell was the authority in American astronomy at the time, and Payne a mere graduate student, not to mention the gender dynamics that would have been present. But Payne was not one to defer to authorities lightly. She clearly held her own, for instance, in her contentious meetings with Russell in the fall of 1924. Perhaps most tellingly, in her autobiography, she tells a story about a scientific matter on which she did defer to the authority of Russell and Shapley. When she was still an undergraduate in Cambridge, she had come across an astronomical problem that vexed her. She believed a spectral shift known as the Stark effect should be seen in some stellar spectra, but it was not discussed in the astronomical texts of the time. Riding her bicycle up to the Solar Physics Observatory, she accosted the first person she saw with her question. The man turned out to be Milne of the Saha-Fowler-Milne theory. Milne admitted that he didn't know the answer to her perceptive question, and they soon became good friends. After arriving at the Harvard College Observatory, she tried again, this time finding data that suggested the Stark effect was visible in some spectra. She brought the idea to Shapley, who shared it with Russell. Both were skeptical, and she was convinced not to publish. Nevertheless, Payne did not back down completely, including a carefully cited discussion of the proposed effect in her dissertation and suggesting that it was important to keep the possibility in mind. 5 years later, experimental evidence for the effect was independently discovered and published. Decades later, Payne was still kicking herself over partially backing down. "I was to blame for not having pressed my point," she writes. "I had given in to authority which I believed was right. That is another example of how not to do research. I note it here as a warning to the young. If you are sure of your facts, you should defend your position." This missed opportunity occurred during the same period of her life as the question of hydrogen and helium abundance, with the same principles, Payne, Shapley, and Russell, involving the same kind of data. In fact, it could so easily have been applied to what she wrote about hydrogen and helium abundance in her dissertation that some modern accounts use the quote out of context, implying that it applies to her dissertation. I expect that if Payne had felt that she had caved on the question of hydrogen and helium abundance in her dissertation, she would have included it in her regrets, just as she did with the Teller-Stark effect. So explanation 2. Payne was misled by Russell, who wanted to steal her idea. This explanation is included for completeness, as it's alive and well in some of the less reliable corners of the internet. While such things have happened all too often in the history of academia, and continue to happen today, this is not one of those cases. Russell's personal incentive here would have been to bury the idea, as it would undermine much of his other work, not steal it. Let me briefly explain that. Eddington, remember Eddington back at Cambridge, was the master of making mathematical models of the interiors of stars. And it turned out he found out it didn't depend much what stars were made of. He got the same answers, as long as stars weren't mostly made of hydrogen. But he figured, what's the odds? There's 90-some elements. The only one that will screw me up is hydrogen. I'll just assume it's not hydrogen and keep going. So he spent years and years making elaborate models, very complicated, very time-intensive to compute. Russell then starts building theories based on these models. Nobody really wants to hear that their work of the last decade is all based on a bad guess. Explanation 3. Payne was misled by Russell, who wants to suppress her idea. Aha. Unlike explanation 2, this is not completely implausible and may have contributed to what transpired. It's quite possible that while this was not a conscious motivation on Russell's part, his desire to save Eddington's model and his own theory of stellar evolution caused him to be more dismissive of Payne's result than would otherwise have been the case. Explanation 4. Payne, educated as an astronomer in the early 1920s, believed, as did most astronomers, that the composition of the sun was similar to the composition of the Earth, and thus doubted her own results. This view is summed up by Gingrich. She really didn't know what she had it, he wrote, that is the right abundance of hydrogen. It is very difficult, I think, and my reading of it is that she was fully accepting the arguments against it, and therefore didn't have that as her discovery, even though she had made those calculations in her thesis. Because everybody at that time believed in the uniformity of the universe, and therefore assumed that the sun should be similar in composition to the Earth, and so this was the basis of Eddington's making stars primarily out of iron and so on. Okay, but why, if she were already thinking this way, did Russell need to repeatedly emphasize to Payne, as she was writing her dissertation, that her results for hydrogen and helium were wrong? She already thought that, she would have done it herself. Explanation 5, Russell was tricked by Payne, who wanted to get her analysis into the scientific record without running afoul of Russell. This is the idea suggested by Dvorkin. But if this was her plan, why did she not at least mention hydrogen in her radio address later the same year? Later that year, she got to give a radio address, and she was still on. It's just like the Earth and all this kind of stuff. Stuff was already published. Her dissertation was done. She was Dr. Payne, right? She was still saying the same thing. In addition, Payne was not shy in later years about admitting other schemes, that was her word, that she had employed. For example, she knew that the 1924 topic of the prestigious Adams Prize at Cambridge had been chosen so that Fowler, of the Saha-Fowler-Milne theory, was certain to win. And if Cambridge would not award women a full degree, it certainly wasn't about to award one a prize of this kind, and in fact did not do so until 2002. So, to show that she belonged in the same conversation, Payne gave her dissertation a subtitle based on the prize topic chosen for Fowler. Payne also had a well-formed opinion of Russell's personal trait. He was selfish, overbearing, opinionated, and conceited. She said that you could admire him, but I could never like him. He sort of gave me the creeps. And one of the things that was alarming was the enormous amount of power he wielded. Fortunately for me, he backed me, but if he didn't, ... If Payne had actually pulled a fast one on Russell, wouldn't she have told of her victory in the years after he passed away? Explanation 6, last one. Russell believed he was right and mostly convinced Payne. This explanation assumes everyone was acting in good faith, and Russell simply won the scientific argument. As is often the case early in scientific disputes, the truth may not yet have the preponderance of evidence on its side. There was a good deal of astrophysical theory that had been built up on the assumption that the composition of the sun was similar to that of the Earth, and those theories had achieved notable successes when compared to observation. A single line and a single letter did not convince Payne. It took months of exchanging drafts and letters, as well as face-to-face meetings before Payne was finally convinced. Even then, her conviction was not deeply rooted and soon dissipated, but at least while she was writing her dissertation, it was sincere. That is not to say that scientific conversions never happen all at once via a letter. In fact, Payne was present when that happened to Shapley. For years, Shapley had been arguing that our galaxy was the only one of its kind, and that the spiral nebulae viewed through telescopes lay within it. In late 1923, Hubble discovered a Cepheid variable within the Great Spiral Nebula of Andromeda, and then, using a relationship developed by Henrietta Leavitt at Harvard, another one of the Harvard computers, determined its distance to be 300,000 parsecs, thus placing the Andromeda Nebula outside of and equal in stature to our own Milky Way galaxy. The Andromeda Nebula had become the Andromeda Galaxy. In early 1924, Hubble sent a letter detailing his results to Shapley. Payne was in Shapley's office when Shapley read it. Here, he said, holding the letter out to Payne, is the letter that has destroyed my universe. From that point forward, Shapley dedicated himself to studying these other galaxies. His conversion had taken place in the time it took him to read the letter. Again, if Payne had been particularly shaken by a single letter from Russell, wouldn't she have drawn a parallel to Shapley's letter from Hubble? My thoughts on the matter. There does not have to be a single answer. People often act from a variety of motives, and in such cases may have a particularly hard time reconstructing those motives later. The way Payne discusses these aspects in her dissertation, her lack of a definite recollection of what she'd written, and the text of her radio address together suggest to me that she did not feel an active conflict at the time, i.e., that she managed to convince herself that what she was writing was scientifically defensible. Her lack of rancor towards Russell over the sequence of events, despite her evident distaste for his personal style on scientific matters, suggests that she does not feel she was misled or successfully browbeaten. On the other hand, When she first computed stellar abundances, she may have taken them at face value, thinking they showed a large abundance of hydrogen and helium, and within a year or two of completing the dissertation may have reverted to that view. Russell, for his part, was likely influenced to some degree subconsciously by his stake in Eddington's models, which in turn depended on stars being primarily made of anything but hydrogen. But if so, then he himself held a deep belief that the hydrogen abundance in stars was not high. He would not have been tricking Payne, except to the extent that he was tricking himself. Of course, more cynical interpretations are possible, particularly if we allow for the possibility that Payne, over her career, deliberately covered up her motivations and/or Russell's actions at the time. Payne does not strike me as that kind of person, but I leave it to my readers to form their own opinions. Okay, thanks. That's what I wanted to share today. I'm happy to.
Has there been any contact between Hans Bethe and Payne? You understand why I'm asking, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, but this was too early.
Yeah, we don't have two.
I mean, when Beta, for example, sorry.
No.
Yes, exactly. This is 1924, right? Later in the career, absolutely. I mean, eventually Payne becomes chair of the Harvard Astronomy Department. By the way, not after first being passed over for it, even though she wanted it. First for one guy, and then they got another guy, and by the way, all this time, the directors of observatories were saying, boy, you know who would really be great? Except she's a woman. There are literally quotes like that. Literally quotes going on like that. And so, you know, she kept getting passed over for the Harvard chair. The third person they brought in took one look at the situation and said, I am not doing this because it's going to stunt her career. Not necessarily she should be chair, but this is just a bad dynamic. This is not good. So then they had to find somebody to replace him. Menzel, 20-page dissertation guy. So he ends up being chair. By the way, he ends up being a competent astronomer over his career, right? I don't want to trash him totally. There are other people in here I trash totally, not him. But so she then, I think after that, or maybe after that, I think, finally becomes chair of a department. By that time, sure, she was talking to Beta. She'd moved on from that kind of astrophysics. She became very interested in, well, wide variety of things, but variable stars, things like that. So she wasn't really working in the core of the sun. She never was, really. But certainly she knew Beta.
I read someplace a long time ago that Arnold Shapley referred to her, I think it was her, as the best man at Harvard. Did you ever come across that?
I would have to check it. I have heard that quote. I don't remember. Oh, sorry. The question was that that supposedly Harlow Shapley once referred to Payne as the best man at Harvard. And the question is that, you know, I have learned to be leery in writing this book of assuming that such stories are true. Let me give you just a couple examples of things that appear not to be true, which are repeated in every book, including history books on this, right? The idea that the Harvard computers were routinely referred to as, the director before Shapley was a guy named Pickering, were routinely referred to as Pickerings Harem. A lot of you have probably heard that. Doesn't seem to be the case. The first appearance of that in anywhere is in, I think, the 70s. And it is, yeah, I mean, there just isn't any contemporary evidence for it. And these people wrote journals and stuff, and they were not shy about complaining about slights and being underpaid and things that were going on. Sometimes people say, oh, there isn't any evidence because they were Victorians and they didn't like to say that. No, I mean, the tit degree, right? I mean, they would talk about that, right? They weren't going to not mention the Pickerings Harem thing. Maybe we'll learn that there was somebody once who said it somewhere. But the modern idea that you come across is that everybody was calling it that. That was the derogatory nickname. That just wasn't the case. It wasn't the derogatory nickname. Likewise, the notion that the Harvard computers started because Pickering was frustrated with the mistakes that his male computers were kind of assistants, those male computers were making, and said, you know, my maid could do better than this, and I could pay her half as much. Okay? He did hire his maid, but after the computers were already there. And in fact, the first computers were the first female computers were hired at Harvard before he was there. And in fact, probably a large part of the inspiration for hiring those computers was the great mid-19th century American astronomer Mariah Mitchell, who gave a speech in front of the Association for the Advancement of Women, saying you should be doing stuff like this, and was friends with the first two directors of Harvard College Observatory, close friends, and had worked for the third as a computer elsewhere, and then Pickering was the fourth. The modern narratives erase Mariah Mitchell. It's really weird, right? You have a woman pushing for involving more women in science, and the modern narrative is always this penny-pinchy guy thinking I could pay the women half as much. By the way, to start with, they got the same pay. The reason their pay fell behind is that as they expanded what they could do, as they should have risen through the ranks, their pay stayed low. So it was a differential over time. But the initial pay for the computers was the same. So it's another one of those stories you'll come across everywhere. So I love the line. It's one of those things that I think does properly capture the flavor of it. I don't know if Shapley actually said it.
Some of the other characters in the story have had backgrounds. I mean, later, Eddington, particularly, the way he treated Chandrasekhar on the White Dwarfs.
And honestly, Eddington, despite being responsible for her big break, right, he does not treat her well later. She never loses a fondness for him. They never stop kind of being friends. But he's really the first one who's of any prominence who is failing to cite her for the hydrogen and helium thing. He would cite her for other things. He would praise her to the skies, but he starts citing Russell for that. And Eddington is really the first one I found who's doing that. So he really, yes, there's a mixed bag there. Yeah. On the other hand, I love Eddington's stuff from the 20s and 30s. The sort of popularizer stuff is a wonderful read. But yes, I mean, complicated guy.
About, actually, in your introduction, Pam showed some of your other work, and I was wondering if you would thought about translating some of this into children's books or other books that might appeal to younger boys and girls. Children.
Yes. An interesting question. I haven't actually thought of doing that with this set, although I have certainly joked with my wife, who is a historian, and actually was the one who kind of gave me the framing to write this book. She was like, why don't you do this, right? And I discovered in the process that history is very hard. It's very hard. But, we've sort of joked about sort of the Hidden Figures route or something, right? You could do something like that with some of this, or some other kinds of things. We've thought about even historical fiction. I didn't think literally of a kid's book. I'm almost a little hesitant for the following reason. Maria Meyer is one of two women to win the Nobel Prize in Physics. By the way, 1903, 1963, did we get another one in 2023? Is that what we have to do here, right? There have been two. And one of them was Maria Meyer. And really, there are no book-length biographies of Maria Meyer. There are a number of kids' books appearances. So oddly, I think we're doing a little better in that framing. You'll find Maria Meyer popping up in a lot of those places. But as, the way that you would do it's one of the reasons I wrote this book, honestly, was that I wanted something that was substantive, that gave some Maria Meyer information, because the Nobel Prize website had a fundamental fact wrong. And we had to fight and fight. At my last institution, we finally got the president of the institution calling like the ambassador from Sweden or something and saying, you got to fix this, because it was claiming that she had been part-time for 1 year or something at Sarah Lawrence where I was at. She started part-time. By the end, she was full-time. She was advising students. She was developing new classes. Give you a quick Maria Meyer quote. This is one of my favorites. She was designing this new class, doing a very Pam-like thing, right? This new class that was going to be integrated and was going to teach all these kinds of things and be exciting and going to be no requirements to take it, no prerequisites, but it was going to be cutting-edge science. And she's talking to the president of Sarah Lawrence, who's skeptical. And the president says, well, you know, this is interesting, but, you know, shouldn't we be, and Sarah Lawrence at the time was all women. It's not now, but was then. And said, you know, it's all very interesting, but shouldn't we be teaching these girls practical skills they can use in the home, like how to regulate a furnace? And so Maria looks at the president, who his background was in literature or something, and said, ah, and I suppose we teach them literature so that they can read a cookbook. She was allowed to teach the class. You know, so now eventually the Nobel people did change the website, although they're still very reluctant. They really like the quote that University of Chicago, where she went next, was the first place that did not treat her as a nuisance but welcomed her with open arms. Yeah, University of Chicago didn't pay her anything. Zero. Right? Yeah, they liked that. That was a good deal. But whereas Sarah Lawrence paid her a normal salary and kept giving her. In fact, when Sarah Lawrence sensed that they might be losing her, it's just like there's this enormous flood. I've been through the archives of raised letters, right? We'll give you another 1,000. We'll give you, you know, really trying to keep her. She was not welcomed initially with open arms at Sarah Lawrence. That part is true. The quote is actually from her, because Sarah Lawrence was skeptical of this high-powered research person being able to be in a teaching college. And she, to tell the truth, was a little skeptical herself that she could do it. She ended up loving it. She ends up working on the Manhattan Project, right? And there are letters back and forth between her and Curie on the Manhattan Project where he's trying to get her for more time. And she says, you know, if this takes me away from teaching those girls at Sarah Lawrence, I understand it's my duty to the country, but it's not worth it. Okay? So she ends up loving it there. They end up loving her. She doesn't start that way. Anyway, if you look at the Nobel Prize site, it does not look like that at all. So, you know, partly for my last institution, but in general, I just thought there were a lot of things where the record had to be set straight. And these kids' biographies do okay, but of course, they're not going to kind of give that sort of feel of it. Yes? I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about the archival sources that you used? You mentioned Sarah Lawrence.
Yeah.
Was there enough material? Were you surprised that some things were gone?
Yeah, so the question is to talk about the archival sources that I use and was there enough material and this kind of thing. First of all, a sort of disclaimer, okay? This is IOP's Concise Physics series. They're meant to be a little bit quick and dirty. There are other history books in the series too, by the way, and they are meant to be that way as well. I had to sometimes hold myself back from, you know what, I have to take a trip to, you know, Massachusetts to look into the archives over there. It's like, you know, I'm supposed to get this out, right? So I did not do as much archival research as I wanted to. I was ILLing stuff. I was going to the archives at Sarah Lawrence for Meyer. I was searching all sorts of corners of the internet. I was sometimes, you know, sending letters back and forth and that kind of thing, but I wasn't quite getting into the archives as much. But along the lines of your question, when I said history is hard, I am shocked that, for example, Harvard in the late 19th and early 20th century, that there are a bunch of things that we just don't know. I like, how hard must it be to do history? I have a very, you know, I now have a new appreciation for what my wife does, and for any historians that might be in the room. How hard must it be? There can't be some place that you would think would be better recorded, right? And yet there were big gaps and big things that were tough to figure out, and that I had to do the detective work on, and I had to be going through old reports being sent just like yearly reports and that sort of thing to dig out pieces of it. And so, yeah, there actually are a lot of gaps. There's this strange mystery that I would like to go further into. If you want a villain of the piece in here, it's this guy, and some of the physicists in the room may know who this is, maybe even knew him, and I'm sorry, but he comes off as a villain. This guy Telegdi at University of Chicago. Okay, what a piece of work. He is constantly coming up with excuses as to why he didn't do this big experiment first and why it wasn't such a big achievement anyway, and sour grapes, and it's just this ridiculous kind of thing. One of his excuses is that his father passed away, and his father was in Italy, and he had to go to Italy kind of settle his affairs, and that was the crucial few weeks that would have allowed him to be first. Okay? Well, first of all, his father died in September, and the time when the experiment comes out and kind of a crucial few weeks when this is done and all of this is in January of the next year. Okay? But the weird historical discrepancy, which someday maybe I'll go to Chicago and dig through their archives and figure out, is that he says, in a self-defeating sort of way, but it's true, he says, yeah, this is what slowed me down. Once I was done with my teaching for the semester, in December, I flew right out to Italy. Okay, well, that kind of shows that there's a certain kind of priority confusion here, right? I mean, it's great, he put teaching over research, right? But the ranking was apparently teaching, family affairs, research, and then you don't win the race in research. Okay, meanwhile, Chen Cheng-Wu had a round-the-world cruise planned with her husband that they'd been planning for years, and when she got a chance to work on this experiment, she said, okay, honey, you go. So there's a certain amount of deserved even by this scale. But here's the weird part. The guy who was working with Telegdi, working with him on the experiment, tells it as Telegdi leaving in September and being gone most of a semester. I don't understand. How can those two people have that different a recollection? That's one of those things I want to dig into and find out at some point. It's just a strange mismatch, and I don't get it. Maybe there was a different year where something like that happened and he's remembered and he's conflated the two in his head or something, but it's weird.